Okay, so in part 4, we're going to look at class today. So I just touched upon in the previous slide kind of the notion of the bogan, a term that's been used in Australian kind of discourse for a long time, probably tailed off a bit in the last few years, I think. And it's kind of a good example of symbolic violence, but it's an interesting example as well in terms of what started as a symbolic violent term developed into something that sometimes some people would actually say that I am a bogan and organise their self-identity and performance of self around it. So bogan, generally was used to kind of denigrate mostly white working class people with bad taste, people that don't conform to taste and leisure practice of the middle classes. Was certainly, to begin with, kind of attributed to kind of white working class people, particularly in Western Sydney, and it was often also attributed to kind of rural and suburban people. It increasingly, throughout the kind of 2000s, started to have more ethnic connotations as well, and related to kind of Lebanese Canterbury Bulldog supporters and stuff like that was used quite a lot. If you're interested in looking at this, I've written a lot about the relationship between bogans and hipsters, and you can check that out in the book Youth Class and Everyday Struggles. And so this terminology, this kind of symbolic violent terminology, was used a lot in the media. And why was this the case? Well, people in the media tend to be kind of more middle class people, more cultural capital, and so people writing in the media tend to be able to write about their own tastes and interests, and would therefore kind of look down their noses and kind of denigrate people without that and call them bogans. When it comes to the relation to the hipster, which I've written about, as I said, middle class people tend to have more affinity with the notion of hipster cultures, and when they wrote about the hipster, they tended to kind of be a little bit insulting as well, but more kind of nudge, wink, wink, the hipsters are okay, and I'm kind of a hipster anyway. So this is a good example, I think, of relationality of who how people in particular professions get to kind of decide what's seen as normal, get to decide the hierarchies of taste and class and culture, and get to kind of decide who's a bogan and who isn't. There's a classic, I think Today Tonight, or a current affair story there you can link to about the cashed up bogan. And this is particularly at a time when it became clear that people in the mining industry were earning lots of money, sometimes more than the professional middle classes, and there was all this kind of consternation about how this wasn't fair. Why should people with no skills, flying in and out of mining, earn more than me? I went to uni for 10 years, and there was, in the kind of 2010s, there was this kind of moral panic about this kind of stuff. Very interesting to kind of think about the class relations there. The cashed up bogan kind of was a reorientation of the middle class to emphasise symbolic capital through this symbolic violence, because the working class has come to possess a greater share of economic capital, particularly those kind of miners, and kind of challenge the economic and cultural dominance of the middle classes. So the bogan, I think, has been a kind of an interesting case study. It's kind of faded out a bit, and so has the hipster, but terms like this do come and go, and it might make a comeback at some stage. A term that kind of is used in symbolic and violent ways, but then kind of people in pop culture and comedy in particular started using it as a kind of form of self-identity. Terms like this often are used for satire and parody purposes, but again, there's kind of interesting debates in the critical analysis of things like comedy about what kind of counts as good comedy and bad comedy, punching up versus punching down. And again, I think these are nice illustrations of how class is discussed in kind of our cultural discourse without really referring directly back to class. It's more through these kind of class-like labels. There's obviously real relations between class and the other forms of inequality that we're looking at in the course. In the week on race, we'll be kind of talking about relations between class and race. In the week on globalization, we saw kind of this broad scale inequality across the globe, particularly between the so-called North and South. It's also kind of obvious relations between class and gender. This is particularly the case because class has conventionally been understood through one's family, where each kind of member of the family was seen as the same class. But what this kind of did in those kind of traditional renderings of how families work was largely render the woman invisible. It assumes that their class position can be defined by the class position of the male spouse. And this is obviously the kind of the case sometimes, but not so much in others. So in terms of kind of one's class position, it becomes pretty clear that a woman be in a disadvantaged position. For instance, if there's a divorce that happens, they tend to have much less superannuation, can't often afford to kind of to buy the house, and kind of rendered in a kind of more powerless position. So the kind of feminist critique of this kind of stuff has been quite prominent in the past 30 years, particularly through the second and third waves of feminism that we'll look at in future weeks as well. And it relates to kind of changes in the structures of employment and finance more broadly. The family has kind of changed. Single-parent households and stuff like that are increasingly common, same-sex households as well, and this kind of challenges some of those family conventions around class and the way that kind of institutions such as the welfare state and education treat family structures. Again, since the Second World War, more and more women have got out into paid employment, and again, this has kind of changed family structures as well. But in terms of like the class analysis of labour markets, women tend to be kind of pushed towards more flexible, precarious work. There's also, that we'll talk about in detail in the week on gender, this kind of patriarchal kind of dividend where kind of things like domestic labour just aren't paid for. They aren't on the balance sheet of capitalism. It's up to largely to women to do this stuff. And this, from a kind of Marxist feminist point of view, is a key form of patriarchal exploitation. Further, there's kind of disseminations of different kind of modes of femininity and feminist stereotypes that are often through a class lens. Now, this is through kind of gender parenting and house renovation and that kind of stuff, but it's also around kind of things like respectability. There's some incredible study done by Stephanie Lawler that she calls Disgusted Subjects, where many middle-class women seem to want to define their own kind of distinction in the world, often by denigrating women below them. And this is particularly the case when you kind of analyse things like reality television and fashion shows and stuff like that. So the relationship between class and gender is really important, as is the relationship between all the different kind of intersectional forms of inequality. In the week on digital society, I spoke a little bit about kind of the way that this kind of new realm reinforces and reinvents aspects of inequalities. And when it comes to class, there's some really interesting work recently that kind of engages with Bourdieu's notions of capital and thinks about the way that kind of data itself has become a new way that inequality is disseminated. What Marion Foucault and Healy call eigencapital, a new form of capital that has the potential to help understand the new vectoral kind of digital layer of inequalities, as it does more than just kind of name a new specific kind of capital. It develops this kind of Bourdieusian notion of capital beyond those embodied, objectified, and institutionalized things to kind of show that this is now a separate kind of data level of it as well. Your eigencapital is kind of attached to you from your data traces, all the things you do online, made legible through algorithmic systems, through online banking, through transaction data, streaming activity, all the clicks, all the comments that you make are kind of packaged up into this notion of eigencapital. Importantly, when you think about cultural capital, it's about classification and distinction. When it comes to eigencapital, though, everything is ranked, and that's an important distinction going on here. So eigencapital essentially formulates a data proxy of one's IRL self into the digital realm, and this is where kind of you kind of put into those mosaics and stuff like that I kind of showed earlier on. It may be in the future that we have to kind of try and manage these digital scores, and this might mean that solidarity may erode between people as individuals kind of prioritise their personal advancement over collective well-being, placing everyone in what Foucault and Healy called the road to selfdom, which is a play on words of Hayek's road to serfdom. They argue here that rewards will be for individuals whose data fits normative behaviour models but penalises those whose profiles deviate or lack visibility. One of the things about the risk allocation in terms of these data proxies is that if there's no data of you, if you're kind of conscientious objector and don't use a lot of kind of digital technology or aren't online very much, you're actually in one of the higher risk categories. They just kind of put you there because you're seen as suspect. So increasingly data and these kind of data traces, your eigencapital, according to this kind of analysis, is going to have real effects on people's life chances, life chances in that Weberian self in terms of what you bring to the market. You don't just bring yourself to the market already knows you through this kind of data that they've gathered. In terms of kind of that class relation, again, engaging with Marx here, they see what they call the lumpen scoritariat are those that are pushed to the bottom of this ordinal scale, excluded from access to various things due to low quality data, insufficient data, or non-compliant data. Importantly, as much as the work shows here, these data systems, whether kind of gathered through your digital traces or kind of packaged up into those kind of mosaics, tend to reproduce and recreate already existing inequalities. Okay, so in terms of class today, to sum up, there's kind of, as like any of these kind of concepts we're looking at, there's lots of debate and discussion about what's the best way to look at these things. We've kind of given you some very broad understandings of the basics today. Some writers say that kind of, class is not useful today because we're all kind of consumers now and kind of broken from that kind of production stuff that kind of defines us. Others say that we can kind of think about class through that consumer lens, like Bourdieu and Weber have kind of shown. The kind of way that kind of the so-called the working class today have more and more things to be able to kind of associate status with outside of just their labour. There's also seen to challenge this kind of class system, but others point out that it's actually just kind of a new version of it. People talk about how there's less class consciousness today, that people are less likely to kind of identify each other through their jobs or through their class position, and a declining class politics in the sense that people seem to constantly vote against their own economic interests. Again, this doesn't necessarily, I think, challenge class as a legitimate way of thinking about these things. It's just often the result of these class relations that the theories are kind of set up to be critical of. At the same time, there's been kind of some challenges to the class. There's been lots of amazing class research done, and in the course guides and in the kind of various things we're recommending you read, there'll be examples of that. And this is really important because, as the stats show, inequality is increasing. So, there's if you're interested in this topic, I think there's an essay topic that you can write about whether Australia's a class society or not. To answer that, we expect you to kind of gather together examples of the things I've been talking about today to be able to answer that question using both the concepts and some kind of sociological empirical evidence. Okay, I'll leave it there.